I was tired, tired of trying, tired of waiting, tired of pretending everything was fine. When my relationship fell apart, it wasn't just love that I lost. I lost trust. I lost direction. I lost myself. I walked into that church on a quiet Sunday with no expectations. I didn't go looking for God, comfort, or change. I just needed silence, space, something different from the chaos outside. And inside of me, the church was nearly empty. A few scattered souls sat quietly, their heads bowed. I sat in the last row, not ready to be seen. And then he spoke. The voice was deep, clear, steady. Every word seemed to find its way through the clutter in my mind. He didn't shout. He didn't push. He spoke like someone who had lived through storms and still chose kindness. He talked about starting again, not just after failure, but after heartbreak, about how love, real love, never leaves you where it found you. And in that moment, something inside me cracked, not in a painful way, but like a wall giving way to light. He didn't look like the pastors I'd seen growing up. He was young, strong, confident. There was something grounded about him, as if nothing could shake him, not because he was invincible, but because he had already faced his worst days and kept walking. When he looked out into the room, it felt like he was speaking to me, even though he didn't know I existed. My guard was up, but his words kept reaching through. The service ended, but I stayed in my seat. I wasn't ready to move. I hadn't cried in weeks, but that day, the tears came without warning. Not loud, not dramatic, just soft, steady, real. And for the first time, I let them. He approached me quietly, respectful. He didn't ask why I was crying. He didn't ask anything. He just said, "You're safe here." Simple words, but they hit harder than any sermon ever could. I went back the next week, then the week after, not because I suddenly found faith, but because something in that space and in that voice made me feel like I was slowly returning to myself. The pain wasn't gone, but I was no longer alone in it. He remembered my name by the third visit. By the fifth, he asked if I'd like to help with the weekly food drive. I almost said no, but something in me whispered, "Say yes." It wasn't love at first sight. It wasn't a dramatic moment of fate. It was quiet, slow, steady, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, I was meant to be here. That maybe healing doesn't always come through grand gestures, but through steady voices, kind smiles, and people who show up when you need them most. That day, I didn't just find a church. I found a presence I didn't know I needed, a voice I didn't realize I was aching to hear, a beginning I didn't see coming. I never planned to stay involved, but week after week, I found myself returning. There was something about the way he carried himself, calm, present, fully there with every person he spoke to. Pastor Elijah didn't just preach kindness. He practiced it in every conversation, every gesture, every glance that told you he saw more in you than you saw in yourself. That was rare, and I noticed it more every time we crossed paths. Volunteering started as a favor, something I thought I'd do once to be polite. But the way he asked, like it mattered, like I mattered, made it hard to say no. So I stayed. I helped. And slowly, I found myself opening up. Not because I wanted to, but because he created a space where it felt safe to do so. He never pushed for details, never pried into my past. But when I spoke, he listened with such focus, it almost felt like prayer. His advice was never rehearsed, never vague. He always spoke from experience. One day, after a long day of helping at a community drive, I asked him how he kept going, how he stayed so calm, so steady, even when others clearly leaned on him too much. He paused, then said, "I've been broken before. It taught me how to hold others without dropping myself." That stayed with me. It became routine, but never boring. We worked side by side often. Sometimes we'd talk about simple things, music, books, family. Other times, silence filled the space comfortably. I started to look forward to those conversations more than I admitted, even to myself. And it wasn't about attraction at first. It was something deeper. Trust, respect, familiarity growing in the quiet in-between moments. And it was healing me in ways I hadn't even asked for. He told me about the time he almost walked away from ministry. He'd been betrayed by someone he thought he could trust, and it took everything in him not to harden. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned into the pain and let it teach him. That's when he said something that shook me. When I thought I had nothing left to give, God didn't fill me back up. He reminded me I wasn't empty, just scared. No one had ever spoken to me like that, without agenda, without performance, just truth. I didn't know it then, but I was beginning to heal just by being near someone who lived with that kind of honesty. One evening, after a long conversation, I went home and cried again, but this time, not out of pain. It was release. Something inside me had been locked up so tight for so long, and now it was slowly letting go. I hadn't asked for him to become part of my life. I hadn't planned on letting anyone close again, but something about him made it feel natural, like it wasn't about being saved. It was about being seen. I begged him once, silently, to never stop being that person. And somehow, without knowing it, he never did. I didn't realize it at first. What I felt wasn't infatuation. It wasn't butterflies or longing glances. It was comfort, stability, the kind of feeling you only notice once everything else has been quieted inside you. Pastor Elijah had become more than just a guide or mentor. He was my constant, someone who showed up not just on Sundays, but in all the small spaces in between. There was no defining moment where it all changed. It was gradual, a moment of laughter that lingered too long, a shared memory that made him look at me differently, the way his voice softened when he said my name. I tried to ignore it at first. He was a pastor, and I was still rebuilding myself. I convinced myself it was one-sided, that what I felt was a reflection of gratitude, not emotion, but every time I tried to suppress it, it grew louder, deeper, steadier. He never crossed a line. Not once. But he noticed. And one evening after an event, he said something that caught me off guard. "There's a kind of peace I only feel when I'm around you." That sentence hung between us, honest and unforced. It wasn't a confession. It was an admission, quiet and sacred. I looked at him then, not as a pastor, not as someone on a pedestal, but as a man who'd seen pain, carried burdens, and still chose to love with intention. He made space for people without needing to fix them. He listened without trying to be a hero. And in that moment, I saw him clearly, and I knew my feelings weren't misplaced. We talked about it, carefully, openly. There was no rush, no pressure. We both knew that if this was going to become anything, it had to come from truth, not need. He told me he'd prayed for clarity, not for signs or miracles, but for peace in whatever came next. And when I looked at him, I felt it too. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't temptation. It was alignment. The way we cared for each other became more intentional. We didn't speak in romantic cliches. We spoke in honesty, in commitment, in presence. He once said, "I never expected love to look like this. Quiet, steady, faithful. But it feels like everything I was waiting for." That was when I knew we weren't just growing close. We were falling in love, slowly but fully. There was no hiding it, but there was no need to announce it either. The people around us could sense something had shifted. And the best part, no one questioned it, because they saw what I saw, a love rooted in respect, patience, and something higher than both of us. We didn't plan the connection. We didn't chase it. It found us. And instead of running, we stayed. We leaned in, Love had whispered softly into our lives, and neither of us dared to silence it. We didn't need grand declarations. What we had was built in the everyday, the quiet consistency, the conversations that didn't try to impress, the small glances that said more than words ever could. We never rushed it. We honored it. We protected it. And over time, it became clear this wasn't just a connection. It was a commitment forming quietly beneath the surface. He asked me one evening, not with a ring or a speech, but with a question that carried everything. Would you be open to building something lasting, something grounded, something real? I didn't hesitate. There was no doubt, no lingering fear, just clarity. What we had wasn't temporary. It wasn't a moment. It was a decision, mutual, mature, and rooted in trust. We shared our decision with the people who mattered. There were questions, but no resistance. If anything, there was support, because those who knew us had already seen it happening long before we spoke it out loud. They saw the change in me, the way I carried myself, the peace in my voice. And they saw it in him too, the softness that came only when he was near me. What we had didn't change who he was as a pastor. It deepened it. He became more human in the eyes of those he led, not less. He shared parts of our story with care, not to display it, but to show that love isn't weakness. Love is strength when it's chosen with intention. We grew stronger together. I found my own purpose. With his encouragement, I stepped into roles I never imagined for myself, mentoring, organizing, speaking. Not as his partner, but as myself. He never tried to lead for me. He simply stood beside me, always steady, always present. And I did the same for him. Our wedding wasn't about spectacle. It was about promise. A quiet, sacred promise that we would never stop showing up for each other, that we would keep choosing each other through every season. And we meant it. Married life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it was honest. We faced challenges the way we faced everything else, together. We didn't avoid hard conversations. We leaned into them. We didn't expect the other to fill every gap. We supported each other as two full people choosing to build a life side by side. Years later, I still look at him and feel the same calm I felt that very first day, when a stranger's voice reached into a tired heart and made space for hope again. He never stopped being that voice. He never stopped being that presence. I begged him once, silently from a place of deep fear and longing, to never stop being that light, that anchor, that quiet force that held me up without asking for anything in return. And he didn't. Not then. Not now. And the beauty is, I never have to beg again, because he still hasn't stopped.